Madison Cawthorn has gotten himself back into the news over comments he made at a Macon County Republican Party event on Sunday. Cawthorn called those accused of crimes committed at the Capitol riots on January 6th, quote, political prisoners, and vowed to, quote, bust them out. Cawthorn went on to repeat lies about the 2020 election and said there would be, quote, bloodshed over future elections.
These comments come just weeks before a September 6th Justice for January 6th rally in support of the accused rioters takes place in D.C. Cori Bush called out Cawthorn on Twitter, writing, quote, lies like these are what got people killed on January 6th. Michael Starr Hopkins, Democratic strategist and senior vice president of Firehouse Strategies, and Patrice Onwuka, senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, join us now to discuss. Welcome, both of you. Patrice, I'd go to you first. What do you make of these Madison comments?
Certainly, certainly they are inflammatory. Certainly they are going to get a lot of attention. I think the intent there is to, keep up the ire, keep up the concern over our election system. And he rightly talks about election integrity, but to keep supporters engaged. That may be helpful going into 2022 to make sure that voters turn out, particularly those that would vote for conservatives. But, it doesn't help the overall cause of, banning some of the flames that can honestly burn out of control. And we did see some of that out of control behavior on January 6th.
And Michael, in some ways, Madison Cawthorn has a point in this sense. The conditions that people are held in the D.C. jail are deplorable. I haven't heard Madison Cawthorn decry those conditions before this. So maybe this is one place where Madison Cawthorn and the left can find some common ground, that criminal justice reform needs to be taken seriously, and the way that prisoners are treated is deplorable often in this country.
I started my career out as a public defender, so it's nice to hear that Madison Cawthorn actually cares about, the criminal justice system, the treatment of prisoners, and solitary confinement. That comes as a surprise to me, but that part of it was nice to hear. The rest of it was irresponsible. I think, inflammatory was a nice way of putting it. Look, Republicans and Democrats were at risk on January 6th. So this idea we're going to keep fanning the flame and keep playing to the lowest common denominator, it's dangerous, and I really think it puts our democracy at risk. Like, we really have to start taking this stuff seriously. Everything cannot be about an election. We have to be able to actually get work done, and in its most basic form, not get our politicians killed. And comments like that make that job harder.
Do we even know how many of these people are in jail right now, and what the exact charges are against them? Do we even, because he's making the claim that they're political prisoners, so do we know exactly how many, and does anybody know? I don't know.
I don't have the number. It's a mix of everything from, vandalizing federal property to breaking and entering to, in some cases, weapons or violent charges for different aggression that might have taken place. So it's a number of different charges for different people. I don't know the number, but this is something that's kind of coming to fruition in certain circles, I would say on more the far right, to say that these are political prisoners. They're calling for, justice for Ashley Babbitt. These need to play out with due process in the court system. To Ryan's point, of course, DC jails, there's a lot of reform that we need there, but I don't think that's the point that Madison Cawthorn's making here. Yeah. I would say this, though, electorally, I have to think as a conservative, the worst thing going into 2022 is for Republicans to be bringing up January 6th. Just just technically and strategically, I feel like this is the last thing we need to be talking about. Patrice, would you agree?
I would actually. Maybe for our small segment of the conservative base that gets riled up by this, maybe that drives them to the polls. But really, between inflation, the ridiculous with troop withdrawal under the Biden administration, there are so many that border what we're seeing in terms of illegal immigration at the border. There are plenty of hot button issues that could turn out conservative voters, and rightly so. And so, pivoting back to this issue, excuse me, for those more centrist, moderate, those who say, listen, The 2020 election is done. We need to move forward. And yes, we do need to ensure that, we get rid of the electoral shenanigans that have happened in every local and state and federal election, going backwards. But these are the pressing issues right now, and these are what we need to focus on. So I would agree with you on that, Alyssa.
And Patrice, and maybe for Alyssa too, I noticed a little bit of odd symmetry with the lingo that they're using there to describe J6 for January 6th. The symmetry with the anarchist left and the anti-globalization movement in the 90s, early 2000s would refer to A16, which was an April 16th protest against the IMF and World Bank here in Washington, D.C. And they'd often J20 was, that was the crew of kind of anarchists and black bloc folks who were prosecuted for protesting Trump's inauguration, and so that's lingo that that part of the left would use to describe these political protests that then wound up, in court. And so it's interesting to see the right kind of adopting that lingo and calling this J6 as if it's kind of a marker of a legitimate protest movement.
I mean, I would hesitate to say that that's widely adopted across the entire conservative spectrum. We recognize that was January 6th, and we recognize the out of control behavior that not everybody, but those people who scale the Capitol walls engaged in and should be rightly prosecuted for. So I wouldn't say that's being widely adopted.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a small segment. I think there's an interesting kind of confluence of the far left and the far right actually aren't that different from each other in certain issues, whether it is due process, government overreach. I mean, Glenn Greenwald and Matt Gaetz aren't too far apart in some of their viewpoints. And just real quick to Kim's question, 633 people have been charged in the Capitol insurrection so far, according to Business Insider. Only 45 federally charged rioters have entered guilty pleas so far.
And Michael, do you think there is some argument that you could say, like, okay, fine, these are political prisoners. They engaged in a political act. They broke the law, and so they're being charged for breaking the law. But there's politics involved in it to send a message that it is not okay to try to violently overturn an election. I know that the term political prisoner is so loaded, but when you commit a political crime, is it so wrong to say that you're a political prisoner? Kind of as a former public defender, like how do you think through that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that they're only a political prisoner in the way that a domestic terrorist would be a political prisoner. I mean, when you look at terrorism, it's, an attempt to influence politics through violence. And that's exactly what was happening on January 6th. So I would draw that analogy. And I think when you give them the term political prisoner, you soften what they did and you give them an out. And I think given what we saw,
go ahead.
We give them cover. No. We give them cover and we open the door to these things happening more often. And before January 6th, what I kept saying was the tone in the country is getting so harsh. The temperature's getting raised. We're going to get to a point where we start to see Timothy McVeigh style acts. And that's still my biggest fear. January 6th was the beginning of that. And I worry if we don't lower the temperature, we're going to continue to see those kind of things.
Yeah, I think that's well said, because when you think of political prisoner, you think of somebody like Eugene Debs, who was imprisoned for kind of speaking out against World War I. So criminalized for his political position, not let's say the Weather Underground going and blowing up the Capitol. They would technically be political prisoners if they'd been caught for that. But what they did is they blew up the Capitol, and so they're charged for that actual crime.
But from my understanding, none of these people have been charged with like seditious conspiracy or anything of that sort of alludes to the actual act of an insurrection. So I think that's where maybe some people will say, what are the exact charges against these people? And if it is, if we're saying, well, we're putting them in jail because they are terrorists who were trying to overthrow the government, why are the charges not reflecting that?
So I can actually answer that, and not to get too legalese, but to indict someone on something like sedition, you have to be able to show mens rea, which means what their mind was at the time of the crime. For trespass, for things like that, those are specific intent. Once you do it, it's automatically, I mean, that's the crime. Just the completion of the act itself shows the crime. So it's a lot harder to go into court and say he was thinking at the time X versus trespassing, where you can say, we have a picture of him in the lobby of Congress, therefore he broke the law.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Michael. I would argue that some of these people are actually getting away with lesser charges than if we were going to go into something about overthrowing the actual government. I would also argue that the line of succession was potentially under attack. But with that, we have to wrap. Thank you guys for joining us. And next on Rising, Brianna Joy Gray joins us to discuss the recall election in California. Stick with us.